Hi, I'm Rob Martinez, State Historian of New Mexico, and this is New Mexico History in 10 minutes. Black history runs deep in New Mexico. In 1539, the first African ever to come to this area arrives with Fray Marcos de Niza. He was Esteban, who was an African Moor and was the first official representative of Spain to the native people of New Mexico at Zuni. So it's in 1539 that our African history begins here in New Mexico. Later, when Juan de Oñate brings his colony in 1598, they come as settlers and conquerors, and one of the men is named Alvar Garcia Holgado. He is part African, maybe even full African. We're not sure. The documents describe him sometimes as mulatto in certain cases and as being dark-skinned, but we know he has African background. There were others in the Oñate expedition that came between 1598 and 1600. Some were slaves and servants. Some were settlers of mulatto background. There were also mestizos, Mexican Indians, and of course, Spanish and Portuguese people who were mixing, living together, loving together throughout the following decades. When Diego de Vargas reconquers New Mexico after the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, he returns the Spanish to New Mexico in 1692, 1693, and his pregonero, or town crier and drummer, was a man named Sebastián Rodriguez. He was from the west coast of Africa, probably started life as a slave in the Americas, coming with the Portuguese, but he makes his way into New Spain, what's now Mexico, and by 1689 or so, he's in what is now Juarez, Mexico, called Guadalupe del Paso. That was part of New Mexico back in those days. He makes his way to New Mexico with Vargas, and by 1697, he marries a local woman and becomes part of the local New Mexico population and story. He has two sons with his wife. Her name was Juana Apodaca. And one son, Esteban, takes on the job that his dad had. He follows in his father's footsteps and becomes a pregonero in Santa Fe. And another son named Melchor is one of the first settlers at Las Trampas, New Mexico. We know from documents in the 1700s, like diligencias matrimoniales, those were marriage investigations, and marriage records and baptismal records, that there were people of mixed African ancestry in New Mexico. They appear as Moriscos or as mulattos. Moriscos were people who were part African, probably more Hispanic, but still they had African ancestry, and then the mulattos were considered half African. So they are here throughout the 1700s and into the 1800s. The census records from 1750 and 1790 also show people of mixed African ancestry living in New Mexico, living amongst and with people who were Spanish and mestizo, all mixing together and living and loving together. It's interesting when you read reports by Spanish governors and priests in that colonial period that they mention mulattos and mestizos a lot. At Cochiti in the 1770s, a priest there, Fray Mariano de Marulanda, he was a Spanish priest from Mexico. He came the way a lot of priests did and governors in those days, with a bit of a superiority complex. He looked down on the local people. And the Hispanic people living around Cochiti in the 1770s, he described quite often as mulattos, or de calidad mulatto, which wasn't just a caste or race designation. It was that, but it was also somewhat insulting in those days. He was saying that they were of a lower class. So we have these documents and records telling us that these folks are here. In 1801 in Albuquerque, a priest described the local population as Genízaro Indians, mestizos, and mulattos, and that some had some Spanish blood, but not a whole lot. Well, when we get into our Mexican period, starting in 1821, we know that there are people here of African ancestry, by 1829, Mexico abolished slavery. That means slavery was allowed in certain areas. It's one of the reasons that the people of Texas, the Tejanos, get angry because they are Americans who come in with slaves and they want to keep their slaves. New Mexico doesn't have slavery, thankfully, at least black slavery. We didn't have the economy to do that. It was a relatively poor area. And besides, the Native Americans were being put in servitude in the 1700s and well into the 1800s. By the territorial period, we have black Americans coming from the east. Some of them are fleeing the south, the constraints of racism and slavery in that part of the North American continent, and they're coming to New Mexico. Texas is a slave area. New Mexico is a free territory. So you start to see people coming here, black African Americans who become buffalo hunters, buffalo soldiers, and they also become cowboys, very adept at riding horses like the Comanche people or the Hispanic people. That cowboy culture is an amalgam of Spanish colonial and Mexican ranching traditions that blend with Anglo-American farming and animal husbandry techniques. Well, the African Americans are right in there. They bring a lot of knowledge and experience and become part of the local scene. There was one man named George McJunkin that I find very interesting. He was born a slave in Texas in the 1850s. By the late 1860s, he ends up in New Mexico where he learns to be a cowhand. He learns to be a cowboy, and he works in ranches in New Mexico, Colorado, West Texas. And he's also, for me, this is fantastic. He's also a historian and a musician. He plays guitar and violin, but between 1890, but around 1908, there's a devastating rain around Folsom, New Mexico, where he has become a foreman on a ranch, and he sees in an arroyo, a riverbed that had been washed away, he sees animal bones, and they turn out to be the remains of a bison that went extinct at the end of the Ice Age. Can you imagine that? He collects Stone Age weapons and tools, and they turn out to be archaeological evidence that extend back the ancestors of New Mexico's Native American people by about 7,000 years to 9,000 BC. That's quite amazing. So he's also an archaeologist, George McJunkin, and a very famous African-American cowboy here in New Mexico. Clara Williams was born Clara Belle Drisdell in Plum, Texas in 1885. She ended up attending Prairie View College in Texas and then the University of Chicago. She ended up getting married in 1917 and then attended NMSU, New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, starting in 1928. She eventually earned a bachelor's degree in English, which was not easy in those times. She had to sit in the hallway because professors would not allow her to sit in the classroom while they lectured. Very hard times, but Clara was clearly a very intelligent and driven person. Ultimately, she ended up being a teacher. She taught at high schools in Las Cruces, earning awards as an educator, and even having a street named for her on the campus at NMSU in Las Cruces. Ultimately, the English language building at NMSU would be named after her as well. Clara was a trailblazer and is a hero for not just blacks, but also women and anyone who has faced challenges and obstacles in getting an education. When we get into the 1900s, I also love the story of Baz Owen Smalding. He was also born in Texas, and his family were African-American homesteaders near Clayton, New Mexico by about 1905. He ends up graduating from the Albuquerque Grammar School around 1915 and then attended Albuquerque High School, where he was a fantastic athlete. He was very talented in football, baseball, basketball, and track. He pitched for teams in Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and Madrid, New Mexico in the summers, and then ended up being a pitcher in the Negro baseball leagues, playing in cities like Kansas City and Chicago. And ultimately, he became a teacher in Jackson, Mississippi, also coaching sports. Finally, he also served in the U.S. Army. So that was as Owen Smalding, African American of New Mexico. So as you can see, we have quite a rich tradition of African history here in New Mexico. And yes, February is Black History Month. And it's important that we commemorate that, celebrate it, and learn our African history in New Mexico and in the United States. But not just in February. We need to do this year-round because this is part of our story, and it's a rich part of our story. And we need to remember that Blacks didn't come here just as slaves. They were also explorers. They were settlers. They were business people and are business people. They were cowboys. They were women who helped communities to survive and thrive. So that's it for now. Again, thank you for being with me. We'll see you next time. Adios. Goodbye.